A very good afternoon and welcome to an African Future Focus, Trade and Energy. My name is Nzinga Qunta and I'm so pleased to be in conversation with Marlene Ngoyi, who is the CEO of the Fund for Export Development in Africa at Afreximbank. Thanks so much for your time, Marlene. Perhaps we can start with a broad overview of the state of the energy sector in Africa.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me. Wanted to take the opportunity to thank the high authorities of Saudi for having me here. Thank my African brother Richard Atias and their entire team for organizing the event. It's an honor to be here and speak on Africa today. I think that you start with the perfect question. Let's start talking about energy in Africa and what that means. As you know, the energy sector is strategic for nearly any country in the world. Energy access guarantees you health, better health. Energy is essential to improving education. Energy is essential as you try to industrialize and produce and create economic development, reduce poverty, create jobs. So that's a very, very important sector. And when you look at Africa, today it's 1.4 billion people. In 2040, it's we're expected to be over 2 billion. One of the important statistics to realize is that we still have half of our population that don't have access to electricity. So that is something that we cannot ignore in view of everything that I said to start with. I think that a second point that we need to highlight, which is a lot more encouraging, is to say that in terms of energy potential, Africa is a very key player. Today, when you look at the world, 60% of the solar resources are in Africa. They're beginning to be exploited. When we think about the green economy and the transition to electric vehicles, we know that cobalt is required for that. More than 60% of that mining resource is actually in the DRC and Zambia, 60% of the world's resources. So Africa plays a key role in that. As I think about hydro power, today we have some of the largest hydropower projects in Asia, in China. But when you think about the Inga project in DRC, for instance, you have the potential for 100 gigawatts. That's enough to essentially fuel the entire continent. And then you have gas resources and pipeline projects that need to be put in place to increase that supply, not only for ourselves, but also to export to the rest of the world. So while Africa currently has challenges in energy that need to be addressed, because without resolving that energy question, like I said, we cannot resolve healthcare problems, we cannot resolve education problems, we cannot resolve economical development projects. So we have to resolve it and make sure that the right investments are made to unleash this important vector of development.
So you've given us such an incredible overview of the state of energy on the African continent, but we're here talking about the future and what we can look towards. So as we look there and going towards a greener future, what opportunities and challenges are there on the African continent, specifically when it comes to energy?
Yes, so this is where I think that it's very important, and I've been attentively listening to a lot of the participants in this forum, and I found a lot of intelligence in what I heard. We cannot have one solution fits all for this transition. I mentioned half of Africans today don't have access to electricity. Africa is 15% of the world population. This is a significant amount of people who are deprived from opportunities. I think that I mentioned that there's still a lot of countries in Africa that are dependent on fuel fossil. A lot of people have oil and gas reserves. Some of them are just discovering them. Those reserves are untapped, and they need to be able to exploit these resources in order to then diversify into an energy mix that would include hydro. I think I mentioned England, that would include solar. I think that we're seeing that the technology in the world is allowing for solar to be more and more affordable. But I think that we need to be sensitive, we need to be pragmatic, we need to be humane and understand that that's going to be done, but it's going to be done gradually. Why do I say this? Is because I think that there's an urgency to to decarbonize. I think everybody that's reasonable agrees with it. I think that some people are in a position to start now and say we're going to put ourselves very strict objective, and that's a very good thing. But when you think about Africa, it's 15% of the world population, but in terms of emission, it's only 3% of the world's emission. So Africans are essentially not responsible for emission, but we are part of humanity. We have some of the largest forests. We understand our human responsibility, but I think it needs to be done gradually with the support of all to ensure that those who are the less, who pollute the least, are not penalized and are allowed to develop while obviously expanding their mix and obviously exploiting the renewable energy. I think it's very important to have that approach. I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all. We are all at different stage of development. We all have things to bring to the table. I mentioned the incredible things that Africa has to bring to the table, but it's very important for world leaders, and here I talk about politics, as well as development institutions, as well as private sector participants, to understand Africa is a large portion of the world population. They have a lot of renewable resources. At the same time, they are the parties that pollute the least in the world, and they have tremendous development needs that cannot be ignored. So let's have a gradual plan, a mix. And I think that I'm speaking about this here in Saudi, and it will resonate. Imagine that if in the 80s we had said to Saudi Arabia, you cannot exploit the oil and gas that you have, or UAE, it would not have been possible. And so we have to take into consideration that a lot of governments in Africa still have 50–80% of their revenue depending on oil and gas. And while we should transition, we need to be pragmatic.
As we wrap up our conversation, what opportunities are there in regards to the energy that you've spoken about, and also the potential for Africa when it comes to trade, not only the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, for people who are sitting in the room or watching us online, when it comes to Africa, trade and energy?
Thank you very much. I think that the opportunities are tremendous. I mentioned, just looking at the energy, all of the potential that is untapped. So I think that makes opportunities for investments. One thing that I want to focus on is obviously intra-Africa trade. At the moment, intra-Africa trade only represents 13% of African trades. And when we look at the statistics, we realize that when Africans trade with each other, it's actually more value-add products and services. So that creates more wealth. So that's something that we should encourage. The AFCFTA agreement is now in full-fledged implementation. There have been some testing that have worked very well on the continent. That is something that we certainly have to continue to push. And the energy sector will be one of the components of that trade. I spoke about the hydro energy. I spoke about gas pipelines, which are important to implement, not just within Africa, but even they can even go all the way to outside of Africa, especially in the current circumstances that we have, where there's such a shortage. I think that those create opportunities. So that's one aspect. But I also do believe that when it comes to Africa trading with the rest of the world, one thing that we need to do is to ensure that there's more and more value added to what Africa exports. At the moment, historically, it's been a lot of raw material, very little value staying in Africa, that raw material going to more developed economies and then coming back to Africa or other economies with the value add. I think we need to stop that for several reasons. Number one, we need to create wealth, employment, transfer knowledge in Africa. But secondly, when we think about environmental challenges, I think that it's reasonable to try to say, let's try to shorten the value chain. Let's try to be efficient and not have raw material living in one cargo to go to the to another part of the world and then coming back transform. Let's try to do that on the ground as much as possible and ensure that everybody wins.
Marlene Ngoyi, the CEO of Fund for Export Development in Africa. Thanks so much for your time and insight, and really giving our audience an insight into the energy sector in Africa and the potential for trade there. A round of applause, please, for her as we wrap up this session.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone.